Alright everybody, I have decided to keep point number 7 and discuss it in a separate video because it is the most important one compared to the other 7 that we have discussed. This is because this point provides a layout to what teachers should conduct, their teaching of reading or listening, to how you should conduct your teaching of reading and listening. Thus, to conduct the teaching of reading or listening, we need to pay attention to 3 main areas: pre-listening or reading, while listening or reading, post-listening or reading. So we are going to look at what the teachers should do in each stage of their teaching of receptive skills. Before we get into the 3 areas, let us once again look at the basic methodological model for teaching receptive skills. Usually, the sequence begins with a quick lead-in activity, or we call it as a warm-up activity. So this activity should not be too long. It is an activity where you get students interested in your topic. In this warm-up stage, you, as a teacher, typically come up with an activity that is related to the reading or listening topic without really doing anything with the text yet. For example, if your reading or listening topic is about climate change, your warm-up activity or lead-in activity could be about showing a picture of a forest that has been destroyed by a storm, and then you ask students to discuss a few questions about that picture. For example, your questions could be something like, what happens in this picture? What can you see in this picture? And what do you think caused it? Then you proceed to tell them that today we are going to talk about climate change. Now we can talk about what we should do in the pre-listening or reading stage. To talk about it, we need to recall the 2 approaches for teaching language skills, which are top-down and bottom-up. Quick revision. A top-down approach is the approach where teachers begin with a bigger picture of the listening or reading text. Basically means you try to get the gist, right? The overall meaning, the general meaning of the whole text or the whole content first, okay, before going into details. While the bottom-up approach is where teachers start with the details of the text before going into the bigger picture. Thus, your pre-teaching activity depends on your approach that you go for. If you go for the bottom-up approach, your pre-teaching technique for listening and reading might be something like a vocabulary preview, right? You believe that teaching students difficult vocabulary or phrases first help them understand the whole context later better. If you go for the top-down approach, your pre-teaching technique for listening and reading might be prediction, where you provide students with some discussion questions, asking them to look at the title, the pictures around the text to help them activate their prior knowledge, right? And then you attempt to predict and get the overall meaning of the text before reading or listening to the text. Now, most of the teachers, more often than not, actually combine the 2 together. They start with the top-down activity where they, attempt to get students to predict the overall meaning, the general content of the text, through the use of pictures or any visuals to help activate their prior knowledge. And then they use a follow-up by a bottom-up activity where they, ask students to work on difficult vocabulary to better enhance their understanding when they get to read the text itself. So yeah, so combining the 2 is probably more often than we believe. So when it comes to bottom-up approach or top-down approach, you're not fixed, okay, you're not forced into, or you are allowed to use both together. That's what I'm trying to say, right? So you're not you're not limited to selecting one or the other. So once students have done some activities, they can proceed to the next technique, which is in the while listening or reading stage. So again, in the pre-listening or reading, that is, the stage where students try to deal with any difficult vocabulary or try to learn to predict what the content will be about. So now, once they've done that, you can proceed to the while listening or reading stage, which is quite similar to the practice stage. And in this stage, and according to our basic methodological model, that is the stage where teachers give comprehension tasks or practice, and students read or listen to the text or audio to complete the tasks. Therefore, teachers must select a good comprehension technique that achieves that. And again, a good comprehension technique involves making students think, having clear guides, and making students produce clear responses that can either be linguistic or non-linguistic, depending on your technique. For example, after your pre-teaching of the listening text, you choose one comprehension technique or one comprehension practice for students, which is true-false statements. So while students listen, they have to write down true or false next to the statement according to what they hear. And while students are listening or reading to complete the task, teachers should walk around. Don't just stand still, right? Teachers should walk around and monitor and give help if possible. Okay? Give students time to read the statements and allow them to listen to the audio more than once to help make the meaning even clearer. Okay? So just a quick sum up here. So once they have been introduced to the reading text or the listening text in the form of a prediction or vocabulary preview, they can begin working on tasks. And your tasks, your comprehension tasks, must be able to make them think, they have clear guides, and they allow them to produce clear responses. And as they are doing the task, which just basically means practice, you walk around and you monitor and give help when necessary. In the post-listening and reading stage, that is the stage where teachers check students' responses. So here, it is not recommended that you go through the answers one by one. It can be quite, time-consuming. For example, if the answers are just true or false, then the responses should be quite clear enough, because all students do is writing T or F for true or false. So showing the answers of true false instead on the board can let students compare their answers is a lot faster. However, teachers should also pinpoint any specific items that may need attention to, especially if students still have some doubts or questions on them. And in this post-listening or reading stage, there is another technique. It's what we call a follow-up technique. And this technique works exactly the same as the production technique or production stage. That is where, students work with the data from their listening or reading, and they use the data to produce in the form of speaking or writing. So that is when you integrate the skills in your receptive skills in your production stage. It is your follow-up activity. Okay? Yeah, so in this stage, you can make use of the data that you have done in the previous stages. So for example, you can use the vocabulary from the reading and then ask students to produce, another writing, or ask students to use the words in their speaking, right? You can, have questions for discussion, okay? Relating to the topic that they have just studied, that they have just read. So you can ask further questions on top of their understanding to provoke their critical thinking on the matters that I have just discussed. So yeah, so that's basically what you do in the post listening and reading. So again, it follows a very similar PPP style. So it's going to be starting with the presentation. That is where you introduce your students to your text by means of prediction or using vocabulary preview, depending on the kind of approach you use, top down or bottom up. And then moving on from there, you go to the practice stage where you select some techniques, comprehension techniques that test their understanding. And your comprehension techniques have to be clear, produce clear responses, and also, clear responses, clear guides, and they actually make them think. So things like truth. I've already shown the list of techniques that you can make use of for that stage. And then after that, you check their responses. Okay, you check their responses as fast as possible. If the responses are already clear, yes, no need for you to spend too much time on them. And once they are done with the checking of responses, you can move on to the production stage where they have to do something with the reading or the material that they have done in the previous stages. You could make use of vocabulary. You could use the topic for discussion.